Hello viewers, welcome back and thanks for all of your support through my last video on antinatalism. I think I must have gained something like 50 or 60 subscribers, so it's pretty incredible. I guess this is a philosophical viewpoint that there's a lot of interest in, and I have to say both folks that agree largely with what I'm saying and of course lots of folks that disagree with what I'm saying. So I wanted to make a longer video today to try to give you some background, kind of get to know me a little bit, how I got to start to think about this kind of stuff and what my philosophical positions are on these things. Let me first say that I always accept that I might be wrong. That's one of the first steps as a, kind of a layman philosopher. If we think we're right and we cannot be swayed from our positions, then we're really inflexible and unable to learn anything new. So when I first heard about antinatalism, and let me just define it again, antinatalism is not suggesting suicide. That's not what it's about. What an antinatalist is, or who they are, is someone that feels that for a variety of reasons, bringing life, primarily human life, though David Benatar can define it more broadly as sentient life. Bringing, let's say human to begin with, bringing human life into the world for two reasons primarily is the wrong thing to do. One would be that there's more cumulative suffering than there is pleasure in the world, therefore a net lifespan, when you look at the whole thing from birth to death, contains so much suffering that it's not worth bringing life into the world. Now there's a difference here between starting a new life and continuing a life that's already happening. Once we're alive, we have all kinds of biological drives to want to continue to survive. And if we entertain the idea of suicide, not only is that difficult on a personal level to do because of our biological drives to survive, it would also increase the suffering of the people around us that care about us, because they would lose us and they would feel terrible that we had done that. So there are a lot of motivations once you're alive to stay alive. That's categorically different than bringing a new life into existence. And let's talk about this. This is where it gets really tricky, because neither side of the discussion here really understands this, and I am ignorant to what happens after death as well. As far as I know, as far as I can see the principles of life as they're concerning humans and animals, what seems to be happening is when a human being dies, or when any animal dies, their constituent energies, the physical body, disintegrates, comes back into the earth, into molecules that can then be reabsorbed, and new life is created from that. The idea that there is a soul, or an Atman, if you were into the Eastern disciplines, something permanent that's sort of like a shell of personality, or your particular energies that transmigrates, that moves from life to life. There are many people, of course, on the planet that believe this kind of stuff. I don't see any evidence for it. So I'm going to put that aside. It's not that it's impossible. Let me clarify. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just don't see strong evidence for it. Another thing you notice, we tend not to attribute a soul or an Atman to a tree or a squirrel, right? We don't think that they have the capacity to do that. We ascribe this potential to live again and again, or to live in a heaven or a hell, only really to human beings. So that's a little bit of a flag that you should notice. If it were true, why wouldn't it be true of all sentient life, rather than just human beings? So I have a few notes here I'm going to glance at as I go along here. So you should know a little bit about who I am. I'm essentially a musician. That's what I have done most of my life. Songwriter, guitar player, singer. I also teach Hatha Yoga. I teach a postural form of yoga, and along with that there are some associated philosophies that are, a lot of it's hocus pocus, and I don't believe in it, but these ideas come along with human desires to feel good. But as a yoga teacher and a musician, what I'd like to do is help people feel better in their bodies and in their minds, essentially. I want them to enjoy life as much as they can while they're here. And that's what I want to do too, is enjoy things as much as I can while I'm here. And for those of you that are doing sort of acerbic comments, that's okay. Like I said, any engagement in the channel at all helps to grow it. So if you really don't like what I'm saying and you're commenting, you're helping spread the news. So thank you. Best thing to do if you really don't like what you're hearing, don't comment. Go back to your own YouTube channel, create your own video. Yes, rather than just criticizing others, go and actually do something in the world, right? And then other people you'll get feedback from other people about how you've done, and you'll be able to respond to them. You see, doing that rather than just being critical of a particular philosophy, if you are a pro-natalist, if you think that, life is great and there should be more of it, and an anti-natalist is all wrong, if you're like that, it's actually a responsibility that you have to make life around you, make life for people around you as good as it can possibly be. That's going to encourage someone like me to be a little more, have a little more flex around antinatalism. Maybe I think, well, maybe the world's not so bad. There's so many great people in it, right? I'd want to live in a world like this. If you're the kind of person that makes other people think they don't want to be in the world, you are actually promoting antinatalism. So think about that a little bit, and I would encourage you, try to be creative and productive rather than just critical. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but again, thanks either way. So let's look at the two main thrusts, the two main moral arguments for antinatalism. One is, and the primary one is consent, and this is tricky, but we'll get through it. So if I signed you up for the army when you were drunk and you woke up in in fatigues somewhere in a war zone, you wouldn't be, probably most of you, some of you might be okay with that, but most of you wouldn't be happy with that. And the reason is that you never gave me consent to consign you or conscript you to the army. And the reason we think that's wrong is because we think that human beings should be able to give their consent before something is done to them or for them. Let's imagine a woman asleep on a couch in a party, and a man approaches her and wants to have sex with her. And if he does that without her consent, we call that rape. And the reason for that is that she can't give her consent. She can't give her consent because she's unconscious, right? In the same way that if you've fallen asleep and your friend consigns you to the army, you can't give consent because you're not able to give consent. So a principle here is that when something or someone is not able to give consent, even though you might think they might like it, if they can't say yes to it, you have to assume that you should do nothing. You can't take any action. You need consent before action is taken. Now, when we get to the unborn child that's going to become a human being, this is tricky, right? Because some of you believe there's a soul that wants to incarnate. Again, I don't see any evidence for that. What I see is that there's a potential in the universe, certainly, an intelligence, you could even say, a general intelligence in the universe that seems to be creating life in a biological way. And through that process, again, you can decide whether or not you like it or whether you think it's positive, but you still can't gain consent from the unborn. Let's call it the unborn potential, okay? That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying everybody who's alive is suffering to the degree that they don't want to be alive anymore. The consent argument is simply that there's no way to get the unborn potential to say yes or no. Therefore, if we align that with the rest of our principles of a consent, then we would have to take no action and not have another child come into the world. Now let's take another perspective on it. Maybe this will help. Let's say that, and birth rates in Japan, in Italy, in Canada here where I live in Vancouver, birth rates have been declining pretty much since the inception of birth control in the late 1960s. So as soon as women had access to birth control in every country where it was made legal, you see a decline in the birth rate. So what does that tell you? It tells you that a lot of the women who were getting pregnant in the 40s and 50s and 60s and before that didn't have access to birth control probably did not want all of those children. They may have wanted some of them, but they didn't want all of them. Because as soon as women as a category have access to control their reproduction, you see the birth rate decline. Now, are those women anti-natalists? Well, let's look at it this way. Let's say you're a pro-natalist. You think it's great having kids, and you imagine you're going to get married and you want to have 3 kids. And if I said to you, why don't you have 4? You might say, well, it would strain my resources, and our general standard of living would drop because of the cost of having 4 children. Well, if you don't want the 4th, you've just become an anti-natalist for that 4th child, right? You're making an argument against bringing children into the world because you don't think you could provide the adequate amount of resources, and they might suffer and you might suffer for it. That is an anti-natalist argument. Now, some might want 4, some might 5, but most people are going to have a limit on how many children they want because they recognize the strain on their resources, and that an infinite number of children is not necessarily good for everybody, right? Better to have maybe 1 or 2 and do the best for them. Okay, so consent, that's the consent argument. I think I've covered that pretty well. The second argument, and this is one where some of you have commented, have been more persuasive, and that is the argument that there's so much suffering inherent in life, net suffering. There's good things, but there's also, a lot of suffering, especially near the end of life for many people, that when you add it all together, it's not worth being born again. Different from being born and wanting to end your life, or being alive and wanting to end your life. It's better not to have been born. This is the argument for too much net suffering. Now, I could imagine, actually, a world where the comments in the YouTube videos, excuse me, were all great and well thoughtful, and people around me were really nice. The animal world, I think, is awesome. It's mostly the human world that's challenging. But I could imagine a world structured in such a way that there was so little suffering that it would be hard to imagine that somebody wouldn't want to have some kind of a life in it. That's possible, right? I'm not saying that's happening soon, but it's definitely possible. And in that case, the argument for net suffering might not be as strong. So I accept that, and I'm agnostic as to whether that will ever happen. But it's probably the weaker, for me, it's the weaker of the 2 arguments for antinatalism. I think the consent argument is much stronger. And also, by the way, just so you know, I love thinking about these kinds of things because it's so interesting to see where our biases are. And that's one of the reasons I'm not into it, antinatalism, because I had a terrible childhood or anything like that. I just think it's such an interesting philosophical viewpoint to try to unpack. Okay, well, moving on here. I've already mentioned the decline in birth rates worldwide. So, if me or anybody else who's talking about antinatalism, this isn't because of what I'm saying. It's because of a general trend to have fewer people on the planet, and I think that's okay. I think having the planet, the animals on the planet, and the fish and the trees and the plants bounce back after human impact is a great thing. So I don't think that it's a bad thing to have fewer people. I don't know that I'd want to see no humans. That's a tough one to figure out. Maybe I'll leave that for another video. Okay. So back to ideas of morality. So when we say something is right and wrong, what we mean is we're laying down a moral map onto reality. If I asked you, is a growing tree right or wrong? Is it right that should happen or wrong that it should happen? Or is a waterfall right or wrong? it doesn't really make much sense, right? Because we see those things as just phenomenon. They're just happening. And we don't ascribe whether it's right or wrong. It's just that the waterfall might be beautiful, it might be dangerous, but the waterfall itself isn't right or wrong. It's our human ideas of right or wrong that we are laying down onto a natural phenomenon. And so when someone says something's right or wrong, they may be getting their ideas of right and wrong from a religious viewpoint, a certain set of standards within a religion. They may be inquiring into it from a more philosophical position, where they're trying to understand or ascertain what makes something right and what makes something wrong. And this is, again, challenging territory, but they are not constants. It's more like a spectrum. Some of you are going to think something is more right and more wrong. If I asked you, do you think, should human cultures, let's say, should all human cultures have the right to organize themselves in the way that they want? And many people, especially modern liberal people, will say, yes, I think that's true. We should, every culture, every nation should have the right and the ability to organize their societies in the way they see fit. And then you say, okay, what about cannibalism? What's wrong with having a cannibalistic society where there's, someone is involuntarily killed and eaten? And we would say, well, the reason that's wrong, again, because of the lack of consent, right? So the consent argument runs through so much of our thinking. Most of you, I think, that are pushing back against it are looking at the consequences of nobody having children anymore. And I understand that, because it could mean the extinction of the human species if everybody adopted anti-natalism and no woman ever wanted to have another child. You could look at it this way. Let's say we got there. We're already declining. Maybe in 100 years, there's only, a million or several 100,000 human beings left on the planet. And women have decided at that point to not have any more children. Say, we're done. We don't want any more children. Should we compel those women? Should we force them to have children? Of course not, right? That will mean the end of the species, but it's still wrong to compel them. That's the consent argument again. All you need to do is overlay that back onto, kind of in reverse, the unborn potential. When you can look up into the night sky, you could call that the unborn potential, right? It doesn't have a personality, but it's a potential energy. That potential, there's nothing wrong with the universe being the way it is without human beings. I think it's beautiful. But if you consciously decide to bring a constructed life that can feel and suffer into the world without the consent, and you can't get the consent there, of course, right? I do think that this is the strongest argument for antinatalism. All right, well, I think that's pretty much it for today. Thanks so much for listening. It may have been a little bit rambling, but these are tricky things. And if you can, leave some comments, please, and about certain aspects of what I've been saying, and I will read them. And I actually do go into some of the comments that have been left. I go to your channel sometimes to see, do you have any content? Have you done anything, right? I want to find out who I'm talking to. And unfortunately, most of the time, there's nothing there. So if you're going to comment, that would be great to see you adding something. So thanks again for listening. And if you have any ideas for future videos that you'd like me to cover, any part of this discussion you'd like me to go into further, please let me know. And I appreciate it. And have a happy New Year, everybody.